Have you ever lived so long in silence that you forgot what it felt like to hear another voice inside your home? Eleanor Hayes had spent years alone on the edge of the wild. Her only company, the wind and the creak of her porch boards. Then one winter afternoon, 7 towering Comanche riders appeared at her gate. One of them stayed. But in a land where prejudice could be sharper than any blade, every shared meal, every repaired fence, became a choice between safety and solitude or danger and connection. What would you do if the one person who made you feel alive again was also the one the world told you to fear? Would you bolt the door and protect your peace, or open it and risk losing everything tonight? You'll step into a cabin where the snow never quite muffles the sound of trouble coming, and you'll see why sometimes love speaks loudest in silence. If this story stirs something in you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can walk together into the first chapter. Ooh, ooh. The wind had a way of getting under the skin out here. Not just a chill you could shrug off, but a low, steady howl that slid through every gap in the walls and under every door frame, as if the land itself were trying to remind you how small you were. That morning, it was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow had drifted a good 18 inches high along the porch, covering the boots Eleanor Hayes had left there 2 nights ago. The Hayes homestead, 600 square feet of pine boards, hand-built by her late husband, sat crouched against the side of a gentle rise. It had withstood 6 winters since Henry was gone, but each year the roof seemed to sag a little more under the weight. Inside, the smell of coffee was only a memory. She hadn't had any beans for months. Her breakfast was a small wedge of cornbread and a thin spread of molasses, the last in the jar. She ate slowly at the small kitchen table, the ticking of the wall clock her only company. It had been 6 years since fever took Henry and their boy, 6 years since the laughter had left these rooms. She'd kept herself alive by sheer habit, splitting wood, tending the stove, keeping the place neat. Some days, she thought that was all she was, the caretaker of an empty house. The wind rattled the window panes again, sharp and insistent. She got up, wrapped her shawl tighter, and went to check the latch on the back door. Everything looked to the same white horizon, the Canadian River a frozen line of silver in the distance, the cottonwoods standing bare and still. Then she heard it, a knock, not a frantic pounding, not the impatient rap of a neighbor, a deliberate sound. 7 raps, evenly spaced, like someone announcing themselves to fate. She froze, hands still on the doorframe. Out here, miles from Mesa Verde, no one just dropped by. The last time she'd heard a knock like that was years ago, when a deputy came looking for a runaway boy. That had been trouble enough. Eleanor stepped to the front door, her heart quickening in her chest. She thought of Henry's old rifle on the wall. It hadn't been fired in years, but she could load it if she had to. Another breath, another knock, 7 raps again, steady and unhurried. She unlatched the door. They stood like shadows against the white 7 men, each broad-shouldered and wrapped in thick hides of buffalo and elk. Snow clung to their hair and shoulders. Bone chokers rested at their throats. Their eyes met hers without flinching. Comanche. That was her first thought. The one in front stepped forward. He had a scar running from the corner of his jaw to his chin, his black hair tied back with a strip of leather. Snow melted along his cheekbones. When he spoke, his voice was deep and even, like the wind itself had decided to speak. "We seek shelter." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the doorframe. They carried no rifles in sight, no drawn bows. There was no hunger or threat in their faces, only weariness. the kind you carried in your bones. She stepped back, opening the door wider. Inside, the air changed. Their presence shifted the quiet. They removed their boots without being asked, leaving them by the wall. One crouched near the stove, rubbing warmth into his hands. Another sat cross-legged on the floor, loosening the ties on his leggings. No one spoke. It was not the silence that pressed on you. It was the kind that listens. Eleanor ladled what stew she had left into bowls. Root vegetables, mostly carrots, turnips, a bit of dried venison from last fall. She set them on the table. The scarred man stepped forward, took his bowl with both hands. "Thank you," he murmured. She nodded. They ate slowly, like men who knew what hunger could do. She found herself watching the scarred one, not because he was the largest, but because his gaze held something steady, almost clear. He did not watch her with the kind of hunger she feared. He watched her the way someone might look at a place they'd been before, in another life. After the meal, she spoke. "There's space in the loft. Blankets." The scarred man shook his head. "We sleep on floors." The others were already rolling out their furs near the stove, moving in quiet coordination, men who had shared winters, wars, and worse. Still, she went to the loft and brought down the good quilts, the ones Henry's mother had sewn before she turned cold toward Eleanor. She draped one over each man after they'd settled, her movements light, almost like tending to children. When she reached the scarred man, she paused. His eyes were closed, but his hand reached out, closing gently over hers. Not a grab, not even a request, just a simple, steady pressure, a promise that he was real and that he saw her. Her heart stuttered. She pulled her hand back, went to her chair by the stove. The wind outside was building again, but the fire burned steady. 7 strangers and 1 woman kept it alive, not with words, but with presence, long after the others had drifted into sleep. Eleanor sat watching the flames, listening to the storm press against the walls. She told herself this was just another winter night, that she was just doing what any decent soul would do for travelers caught in the cold. But the truth was, something in her chest felt different, warmer. Not by much, but enough for her to notice. By morning, the snow had piled against the door, and the wind had eased to a low moan. She went to fetch water from the barrel near the hearth. Her hands stiff in the chill. The men were stirring, stretching. The scarred one was already outside, shoveling snow from the porch without being asked. She stepped to the window. He worked with a rhythm that was almost careful, the kind of pace you kept when you weren't just clearing snow. You were measuring your time. Eleanor pressed her hand to the glass. For the first time in a long while, she felt less like the only soul left on this land. The morning light was pale and thin, spilling across the snow like watered milk. It was 22 degrees, the kind of cold that made every movement deliberate. Eleanor stoked the stove, added 2 more split logs, and felt the warmth crawl slowly back into her fingers. The 7 men ate in silence, their bowls cupped in calloused hands. When the meal was done, they rose without a word, rolling up their furs with the quiet precision of people used to moving together. She thought they might all be leaving, and something in her tightened at the thought. Then she noticed the scarred man, Tahoma, still standing near the stove. The others strapped on their boots, tied down the bundles behind their saddles. Tahoma said something in Comanche, and the others nodded. One clapped him on the shoulder before stepping outside into the snow glare. Eleanor watched from the doorway as 6 riders vanished into the white horizon, their silhouettes shrinking against the pale sky until they were no more than dark smudges. When she turned back, Tahoma was setting his pack down by the door. "You're not going with them," she said. He shook his head. "Your roof," he replied simply, his voice low. "It needs work before the next wind." She blinked. "You don't have to, I know." He didn't wait for her to argue. By mid-morning, he was on the roof, boots braced against the slope, fitting pine planks against a gap where the last storm had loosened shingles. She stood below, handing up nails and a hammer, watching how he measured each board, tapped it into place, and secured it with deliberate care. No wasted motion. When he came down, he moved to the barn, checking the door hinges. One was pulling away from the frame. He set the hinge straight, drove in new nails 3 inches long until the door swung smooth. By noon, the wind had shifted. A thin shaft of sunlight cut through the clouds. Eleanor brought out 2 mugs of hot water steeped with dried sage. Tahoma accepted his without speaking. They drank in the pale light, steam curling between them. In the afternoon, he began splitting a fresh stack of firewood 10-pound rounds of cottonwood, cleanly quartered with a single stroke. The rhythm of the axe was steady, almost meditative. Each time he paused, he stacked the wood in neat rows along the wall, largest pieces at the bottom, smallest on top. By evening, Eleanor noticed something strange. The air inside the cabin felt safer. It wasn't just the extra wood or the repaired roof. It was the presence of someone who moved through her space without trying to own it. Before they settled for the night, she saw him take a bundle of sage and hang it just above the doorframe. Why, she asked. He glanced up at it. Keeps away what shouldn't come in. That night, he didn't unroll his bedding in the loft. He laid it near the door, between her and whatever might cross the threshold. His knife lay within easy reach, but his posture was calm, almost at ease. Eleanor tried to focus on her mending a tear in one of Henry's old work shirts, but her mind kept returning to the question of trust. Out here, the wrong choice about who you let in could cost you everything. She could almost hear the women in Mesa Verde whispering, "She's got a Comanche man sleeping in her house." The town was 18 miles away, but gossip traveled faster than a good horse. Yet when she looked across the room and saw him resting with his eyes half closed, listening to the wind, she didn't feel the urge to move him along. For the first time in years, she felt like the night wasn't hers to face alone. Somewhere past midnight, she stirred awake. The fire had burned low. Tahoma was sitting up, his blanket pushed aside, listening. She stayed quiet, watching him. He wasn't tense, just alert, his head tilted slightly, like he was reading the air. When dawn came, she stepped outside to fetch water. The snow was crusted over, hard enough to hold her weight for a few steps. That's when she saw them. Tracks, horse tracks. 3 sets, fresh, pressed deep into the crust. They circled the outer fence line, paused near the barn, then veered off toward the cottonwood grove to the south. Eleanor felt the cold seep deeper into her skin. She turned to find Tahoma standing at the edge of the porch, eyes on the same tracks. "They came while we slept," she said. He nodded once. "They'll come back." A small shiver ran through her, not from the cold. She thought of the rifle inside, the one that hadn't been fired in years, and the fact that a stranger now stood between her and the horizon. Back inside, she poured them both a thin porridge made from cornmeal and a pinch of dried apples she'd been saving for herself. He didn't remark on the gift. but he ate slowly, as though he understood the meaning. After breakfast, he went outside again, shovel in hand. She watched from the window as he cleared the snow from the barn door, then tied a length of rope from the porch to the barn, a guideline for when the storms came again. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow into a field of light. From the loft window, Eleanor could see the cottonwoods, their branches still heavy with ice, and beyond them, the trail that led back toward Mesa Verde. She thought of the 6 riders disappearing into the pale horizon that morning, and the one who had stayed that night. She lay in bed listening to the wind shift through the eaves, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. She realized she no longer heard only the house settling or the lonely creak of wood. She heard the soft sound of another human breathing, steady and near, and for the first time in a long while, she did not feel like the only soul left on the land. By mid-morning, the sun had a watery brightness to it, as if it hadn't quite decided whether to warm the land or just watch from above. The air was sharp 28 degrees, and the kind of stillness that came before a change in the weather pressed against the homestead. Eleanor stepped outside with a small tin pail to fetch water from the snowmelt trench she'd dug days earlier. Tahoma was already out by the cottonwoods, crouched low, studying something in the crusted snow. When she approached, he stood and pointed. Horse tracks. 3 sets again. They had come from the south, circled the barn twice, then moved off toward the rise beyond the cottonwoods. "They're not passing through," Tahoma said quietly. "They're looking." Eleanor followed the trail with her eyes until it disappeared into the grove, looking for anything worth taking. His voice was calm, but it held the weight of certainty. She felt a small knot form in her chest. Back inside, she set the pail down and poured hot water into a chipped enamel basin. As she washed her hands, she remembered the way her neighbors in Mesa Verde used to talk how a single rumor could spread faster than a prairie fire. She hadn't been to town in months, but she knew her land had a value people envied. There was a spring-fed trough in the lower pasture that never froze, even in the deepest winter. Henry had called it the spine of the homestead. Without it, the place would be worthless. It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to nudge her toward selling. She didn't want to say the name that had come to mind, but it rose anyway. Travis Holt. A man whose reputation in Mesa Verde had always been a mix of charm and menace. Years ago, he'd offered to buy her out within weeks of Henry's burial. When she refused, he'd smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Land changes hands one way or another." That had been the last conversation they'd had until now. Maybe at midday. Tahoma came in from the cold carrying 2 armfuls of split wood. He set them by the stove, then sat on the edge of the table bench. She ladled out bowls of thin venison broth, and they ate without hurry. "They might come tonight," he said. Eleanor looked up. "What will you do if they do?" "What will we do?" he corrected. She felt the words land heavy. It had been years since anyone used "we" when talking about her life. "They won't stop at the fence," he continued. "If they think no one here will fight, they'll take what they want." She thought of Henry's rifle, of her own hands trembling the last time she'd held it. She thought of the townspeople who had offered sympathy when she was fresh in grief, then faded away when she refused to be the story they wanted her to be. She thought of the last 6 years spent guarding her solitude like it was all she had left. And she thought of the man sitting across from her, calm and still, as if the whole conversation were just another piece of work to be done. "We should shore up the place," she said finally. The rest of the day became a quiet flurry of work. Tahoma stretched new wire along the north fence, pulling it tight and securing it to posts with fresh staples. Eleanor cleared the path to the barn, packing the snow down so it wouldn't slow them if they needed to move fast. Together, they reinforced the barn doors with a crossbar, 2 lengths of 2x4, cut to fit snug. Near sunset, they carried kerosene lanterns to the outbuildings, but didn't light them. Lanterns are signals, Tahoma explained. Darkness can be your shield if you let it. As they walked back to the cabin, Eleanor noticed how the snow squeaked under their boots in the deep cold. Overhead, the sky was turning to pewter, the horizon blurring where the land met the clouds. The wind had died entirely, a sure sign that weather, or trouble, was coming. Inside, she set a small pot of beans to simmer while Tahoma laid his bedding closer to the door than before. Neither of them said much through supper. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the quiet of people bracing for something together. After the dishes were cleaned and set to dry, Eleanor poured 2 mugs of hot water with a pinch of dried mint from her summer garden. She handed one to him. "They say I'm stubborn," she said after a moment. "Stubborn is what keeps a roof over your head in winter," he replied. She almost smiled. "And what about you? Why stay 6 men rode off? But you didn't." He sipped his drink, then set it down. "The others had somewhere to be. I don't. And you shouldn't be here alone with tracks like that around your fence." It was as close to a promise as she'd heard from anyone in a long time. Later, in the loft, she lay awake listening for sounds beyond the wind. At one point, she thought she heard the faint creak of a saddle in the distance, but it could have been the house settling. Either way, she found herself calmer than she would have expected. In the morning, they went out together to check the perimeter. The tracks were older now, dusted with a light fall of snow. But near the cottonwoods, something new waited a flattened patch of ground, blackened with the remains of a campfire. Eleanor crouched beside it, touching the charred wood. It was still faintly warm. "They camped here," she murmured. Tahoma nodded, scanning the tree line. They were watching. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor caught movement, a black bird lifting off from a low branch, its wings slicing the cold air. She watched it go, a small shadow against the pale sky, and felt the knot in her chest tighten. She didn't know if it was fear or resolve. Maybe both. When they returned to the cabin, she paused at the door. "We don't run," she said. He met her gaze. Steady. "No, we don't." By midday, the light had turned flat and gray. The air held that odd heaviness that meant snow wasn't far off. Eleanor had been in the barn, stacking the last of the hay bales against the north wall, when she heard a low, rhythmic drumming from the east. Hoofbeats, 3 sets. She stepped to the barn door, her breath curling in the cold air. Tahoma was already outside, standing at the edge of the yard. His posture was straight, still, his eyes fixed on the tree line. He didn't reach for his knife yet, but his hand hovered near it. The riders emerged from the cottonwoods. Travis Holt led the way, his broad frame hunched slightly in the saddle. He wore a shearling coat and a smirk that Eleanor remembered all too well. Behind him rode 2 men. She didn't recognize one wiry and sharp-faced, the other young, his eyes shifting restlessly, fingers tapping the stock of a shotgun slung across his arm. Well, Travis called, reining in a few yards from the porch. "Didn't expect to see you keeping such company, Eleanor." Tahoma said nothing. Eleanor stepped forward, rifle in hand, not raised, but visible. "You've got no business here. Travis, Oh, I think I do. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. This land's worth a lot more than one woman can work, especially with a spring that doesn't freeze. Folks in town are talking. They say you've got a Comanche camped out in your house like a tame dog. The wiry man chuckled low, eyes flicking between Eleanor and Tahoma. The younger one shifted again, his grip on the shotgun tightening. "You can turn around and ride back," Eleanor said, her voice steady. Travis's smirk deepened. "Or you can come to your senses and sell before the law takes an interest in what you've been harboring." That was when Tahoma moved. Not fast, not yet. He stepped forward just enough that his shadow fell between Eleanor and Travis. "One step closer," Tahoma said, his voice low, "and you'll have more than words." The air tightened. Even the horses seemed to sense it. The young man with the shotgun flinched, then, almost in the same motion, swung the barrel up toward Eleanor. It happened fast. Eleanor's breath caught. Tahoma crossed the snow like a striking hawk, shoulder driving into the young man's chest before the gun could fire. They hit the ground hard, snow exploding around them. The shotgun clattered away. Travis shouted and grabbed for his revolver. Eleanor's arm shook, but she raised her rifle and fired. The bullet whined past his head, splintering the trunk of a cottonwood just inches away. He jerked back, startled enough to hesitate. Tahoma was on his feet again, dragging the young man by the collar and flinging him into a drift. The wiry man lunged at him with a knife, but Tahoma turned inside the arc of the swing. Steel flashed, and the attacker dropped to his knees, a deep slice across his thigh, enough to end the fight, but not kill. Travis stood alone now, his revolver in hand, his face pale. He looked from Tahoma to Eleanor, then down at his two men sprawled in the snow. "Go," Tahoma said. Travis' jaw worked, but he took a slow step back. Then another. "This isn't over. Then you'd better think harder about how you want it to end." Tahoma replied. Travis mounted his horse, leaving his men to scramble up and follow. None of them looked back as they rode toward the trees. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Eleanor let the rifle drop to her side. Her breath came ragged, more from adrenaline than exertion. "You were right," she said softly. "They came." Tahoma glanced at her, blood on his hand, not his own. She stepped closer, touching his wrist. He didn't pull away. "I'm not ashamed," she said. "Of you. Of this." Something flickered in his eyes, the faintest crack in that unshakable calm. Not weakness, release. The way a man might look when he realizes the thing he's been protecting no longer needs hiding. "I would have died for you," he said quietly. "You lived for me," she answered. They stood there a moment, the snow settling silently around them. Then Tahoma bent to pick up the dropped shotgun and tossed it into the barn. "We should tie their trail off. Let them know we're not blind." The rest of the afternoon passed in a muted haze. Together, they walked the fence line, marking where the riders had crossed, noting every hoof print. Tahoma's movements were methodical, almost meditative again. Eleanor followed, her rifle slung across her back now, back inside. She cleaned the small cut on Tahoma's forearm, the only mark he'd taken, and wrapped it in clean cloth. They didn't speak much. The fire popped softly in the stove. The smell of wood smoke thickened the air. Outside, the light was already fading. Eleanor found herself standing at the window, watching the last glow slip behind the cottonwoods. Somewhere out there, Travis Holt was nursing his pride. She knew he wouldn't let this go, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel she was bracing for the storm alone. The morning after the fight felt strangely still. The sky was a flat, pale silver, and the air had softened, climbing above freezing for the first time in weeks. Water dripped from the eaves in a slow, steady rhythm. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the snow slump along the fence line like tired shoulders. She knew the change in weather wouldn't be all good news. By mid-morning, the sound of hoofbeats returned slower this time. Deliberate, Tahoma stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing as two riders came into view. The lead man wore a worn brown coat, a silver badge pinned to his chest. The second was younger, carrying a ledger tucked under one arm. "Sheriff Amos Reed," the older man said, dismounting. "Ma'am, sir." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the doorframe. The sheriff's presence was rare this far out unless there was trouble. "What brings you here?" "Sheriff," he glanced at Tahoma, then back to her. "Word in town says you've been keeping questionable company. Says there was a disturbance yesterday. Wanted to hear it from you." "Word in town," Eleanor repeated, a bitter edge in her voice. She could imagine exactly whose voice had carried that word Travis Holt's. Tahoma stood silent beside her, arms loose at his sides, gaze steady, not defiant, just present. Eleanor stepped back from the doorway. "You'd better come in. I'll tell you exactly what happened. Inside." The sheriff listened while she laid out the tracks, the visit, the fight, how one of Travis's men had raised a shotgun first. She didn't leave out her own shot into the cottonwood, or the cut Tahoma had taken. When she finished, Reed nodded slowly. "Sounds like Holt's been stirring more than snowdrifts," he said. "I've had my share of trouble with him, but he's careful about where and how. If he's making open moves, that's worth watching." He closed his ledger and looked at Tahoma. "You planning to stay on here? If she'll have me." Tahoma answered. Reed's gaze lingered on him a beat, then he gave a single nod. "Then I'll tell you both. Keep your eyes open. Holt's the kind that doesn't take well to being turned away." The sheriff was still speaking when the sound reached them, a distant, rushing roar, low but building. Reed's brows knit. "That's the river." Eleanor moved to the window. Beyond the cottonwoods, the Canadian River was no longer a silver ribbon. It was swelling, brown water churning with ice chunks and broken limbs. The sudden warmth had melted weeks of snow in a single day, sending it all racing downstream. By the time they stepped outside, the water was spilling into the low pasture, curling toward the barn. If it reached the foundation, it could undermine the whole structure. Tahoma was already moving. "The gate to the upper sluice, it's jammed." "I'll help," Eleanor said, pulling her shawl tight. He shook his head. "Too deep." "I'll go. You shore the barn." Sheriff Reed swung into his saddle. "I'll ride the line. Warn the others." Tahoma grabbed a coil of thick hemp rope from the barn, looped it over his shoulder, and tied one end to a porch post. Without another word, he waded into the freezing water, each step slow and deliberate. Eleanor's breath caught as the water climbed past his knees, then his waist, the current pulling hard. He reached the sluice gate, a heavy wooden barrier meant to control flow into the irrigation ditch, and found the problem. A tangle of branches and ice had wedged it half open, letting the river spill uncontrolled into the pasture. He braced himself against the pull, worked the debris loose, and forced the gate shut with both hands. The water level began to drop almost immediately. Back at the barn, Eleanor was stacking burlap sacks along the low side, each sack heavy with wet earth. Her arms burned, but she kept going. She'd be damned if she'd let a thaw undo what she'd fought to keep. By the time Tahoma trudged back up the yard, soaked to the chest, the worst of the flow had eased. His hands were red from the cold, but his expression was as even as ever. "You're half frozen," she said, moving toward him. "Not half." He answered, almost smiling. She brought him inside, set a kettle of water to boil, and found an old quilt to wrap around his shoulders. As the stove heat began to seep into him, Sheriff Reed returned. "River's dropping," the sheriff reported. "Holt's place is on the high ground, so he's not touched by it. Figures." He glanced between them. "I'll be back tomorrow with a copy of the county register. Holt's been known to waive false papers. When he wants something, wouldn't surprise me if he tries to pass off some claim on your land." When Reed left, the cabin felt quieter, the roar of the river replaced by the soft hiss of the kettle. Eleanor set a steaming mug in front of Tahoma. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her over the rim. "For the river, for the roof, the barn, the sluice, for not leaving when you could have." He didn't reply, but his gaze held hers a moment longer before dropping to the steam curling between them. That night, as they banked the fire and set the lamps low, Eleanor thought about the way Holt's threats had changed. They were no longer just words, they were turning into actions, some direct, some whispered through the town. But she also thought about the sight of Tahoma braced in the river, the rope tied to the porch, refusing to let the water take more than it should. For the first time, she felt the shape of something solid under her feet. Not just survival, something like partnership. The wind had shifted by evening, blowing down from the north again, dry and sharp. The thaw had slowed, and a brittle crust was already forming over the patches of bare ground. Eleanor had finished checking the barn doors when Tahoma caught her eye across the yard. "Quiet tonight," he said. "Too quiet?" she asked. He didn't answer, but the way his gaze lingered on the tree line told her enough. They had both felt it, that stillness that comes before something breaks. They ate supper by lamplight, the soft clink of spoons against bowls filling the room. Afterward, Tahoma went outside to check the rope lines on the horses. Eleanor banked the fire, then stepped onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight. The moon was just rising, silvering the snow and the bare branches. That's when she saw it, a flicker of orange deep in the cottonwoods. At first she thought it might be a lantern, but then it flared, bright and hungry. "Tahoma," she called, her voice low. He was at her side in seconds. His eyes followed hers, narrowing. "They're here!" Before she could speak again, a shout came from the dark Travis Holt's voice, ragged with drink and something darker. "You should have taken my offer." "Eleanor." A flaming torch sailed out of the shadows, landing in the dry grass just beyond the porch. Another hit the barn wall, fire licking up the weathered boards. Eleanor's breath seized. "The hay, I'll get the barn," Tahoma said. "Already moving." "No, you can't." But he was gone, sprinting through the snow. Eleanor grabbed the rifle from the doorway and cocked it. Shapes moved between the trees, at least 3 men, maybe more. She fired into the air first, the crack splitting the night. "That's your warning," she shouted. "Next shot won't miss." The men hesitated, but then another torch arced toward the cabin. Eleanor swatted it away with the barrel of the rifle, the flame sputtering in the snow. From the barn came the sound of hooves and a furious snort, the horses panicking. Tahoma appeared in the doorway, his coat smoking, a bucket in each hand. He doused the wall, steam hissing where water met flame, then dumped the rest on the smoldering hay. The barn was safe for now. A figure broke from the tree line, rushing toward him with a raised club. Tahoma met him halfway, the two colliding in a spray of snow. The fight was fast and brutal. A single sweep of Tahoma's arm sent the man sprawling. He didn't get back up. Eleanor Tahoma's voice carried over the wind. Inside. Now, but she didn't move. Another man had stepped into the open, revolver in hand, aiming straight at Tahoma's back. Without thinking, she raised the rifle and fired. The shot struck the ground inches from his boots, throwing up a spray of dirt and snow that made him stumble back. Startled, the gunman swung his aim toward her, but that hesitation was all Tahoma needed. In 2 strides, he was on him, wrenching the revolver free and sending the man to the ground with a single blow. The rest of Holt's men melted back into the trees, their retreat marked by crashing branches and fading curses. Only Travis's voice lingered, drifting back on the cold air. This isn't over. Eleanor, you're gonna regret choosing him over your own kind. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of dying embers on the barn wall. Eleanor's hands were shaking so hard she could barely lower the rifle. Tahoma crossed the yard toward her, his breath white in the moonlight. You stayed, he said. I wasn't about to let them take the barn. Or you. His jaw tightened, but his eyes softened. That shot, you could have killed him. I aimed low, she said. Just enough to give you a chance. He studied her a moment longer, then nodded. You're not the same woman I met that first day. Neither are you, she said quietly. They worked together to stamp out the last of the burning grass. The night was sharp with the smell of smoke, the air crackling with the aftertaste of danger. Eleanor knew they had won this round, but Holt's words would hang over them like a gathering storm. Inside, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor felt the weight of what had just happened, not just the attack, but the choice they'd both made. She had stayed on the porch with her rifle when she could have hidden inside. He had run into the barn with fire climbing the walls when he could have stayed safe in the cabin. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was something deeper, something that bound them tighter than fear. Outside, the moon climbed higher, the snow glittering as if nothing had happened, but they both knew better. Some truths only reveal themselves when life strips us down to what's essential. Eleanor Hayes believed solitude was her shield, that keeping her distance meant keeping her heart safe. But the arrival of 7 Comanche riders, and the quiet loyalty of one man among them, showed her something she had forgotten, that trust is a choice we make again and again, even after we've been hurt. This story reminds us that love and connection aren't about grand declarations or perfect timing. They're built in the steady work of tending to each other's lives, mending a fence, facing down a storm, standing side by side when trouble comes. For those of us who've lived long enough to carry scars, it's tempting to close the door and keep the world outside. Yet sometimes, the very thing we fear letting in is what brings us back to life. In the end, Eleanor's strength wasn't in living alone. It was in opening her door when the knock came and finding, in the quiet between heartbeats, that courage can be as simple as saying, "You can stay." Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Your support keeps these stories alive.